Good morning. How are we doing this morning? Glad that you're here, whether in person or joining us online. We're going to continue our series, Clarity in the Chaos, from Genesis chapter 4 this morning is where we're going to spend our time. And just to shoot straight with you, this is a message that I don't want to give. So if I can just tell you that, I tried to give it to Justin. He said, no, I need to preach this one. And the reason I don't want to talk about this and do this is because it's about a specific topic that I struggle with, which is the topic of anger. So in all honesty, how many in the room this morning struggle with anger at times? Okay, the rest of you are lying, okay? Just so we're all on the same page. And I can think of many examples in my life where I got angry because I didn't get what I wanted, and that just wells up within me quickly. In fact, when I was a high school student once, in the middle of a varsity soccer game, I looked at the referee and I said, I can't even say with a straight face right now, it's so ridiculous. I said, hey, that thing around your neck's called the whistle. Do you know how to use it? He then put the whistle in his mouth, blew the whistle, stopped the game, and gave me a yellow card, right? He knew how to use it, apparently. Amazing. Anger. Ever struggle with it? Ever get upset when things don't go the way that you want it to go? Have you noticed that every time we get angry, it typically results in chaos? Like, that's been my life experience. And so the question this morning is this: what's so devastating about anger? What's so devastating about anger? I think we could share story after story if we were to be honest with one another and speak about times where someone blocked me from what I wanted, and in return I gave them your wrath, and it resulted in chaos. You see, what has been clearly seen in the book of Genesis from the very beginning in Genesis chapter 1 is oftentimes the reason that we get angry is because we are first in our lives. We're first. And when we're first, the result is absolutely always chaos. Now, if we could also be honest, we could also say this: there are times in our life when we get angry at injustice, right? I get angry when I hear about stories of bullying. That's just dumb to me, right? That shouldn't happen. I get angry when I hear about stories of abuse or abuse with children. Like that actually makes me angry. I get angry when I hear about people in positions of power using their power, right, to overwhelm someone who's weaker to advance their own cause. Like that actually makes me angry. You see, there are times in our lives when we get angry over things that actually align with God's heart. So here's the thing: being angry is not sin. It's what you do with that anger that determines how things will play out. And it can result in clarity, or it can result in chaos. If you've paid attention over the last few years, just hanging around social media for a little bit, you've seen all sorts of anger, haven't we? People's views on politics, people's views on how someone might choose life choices they make, we get angry. Views on stuff that happened during COVID, we get angry. Like, what's been on the forefront in our culture is we're all being blocked from what we want, and we lose our minds. That's what's happened. So what's so devastating about anger? Through the story of Cain this morning, I want us to see the trail that anger blazes, because it's not a good one. And here's what we're going to see in Genesis chapter 4. The first thing is this, is that anger's pride will sever your worship. Let's look at the first part of the story, Genesis chapter 4, verse 1 through 5. It says this: Now Adam knew his wife. Sorry, I can't read. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again, she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of the sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock, of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. So the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desires contrary to you, but you must overrule it. Listen, in Genesis chapter 4, this story is, if you grew up in church, is a very well-known story because it's the first murder that happens in the Bible. In fact, the story is told in Jude verse 11 that what we see here is called the way of Cain. And the way of Cain always results in chaos. And the way of Cain, every single time, comes down to who's first in your life. It reveals this story, how fast sin progresses. Now, if you're with us last week in Genesis 3, we saw this, that God pursued Adam and Eve in their sin. And we're going to see today that God's going to pursue Cain in his sin. So we can make the observation that God has now developed a rhythm that he actually pursues sinners, which, by the way, is really good news for you and I. But notice, Genesis 4 starts with optimism. Adam and Eve give birth to a son named Cain. I wonder what that felt like for Eve. No one had ever given birth before. Like to watch a baby grow inside her body. It had never happened in the history of the world yet. Here's the first person being born. And I wonder, man, that the joy of that, the wonder of that, like how many questions did she have about how this is gonna play out? And what are we supposed to do when this baby arrives in the scene? And how do we keep this baby healthy? I'm sure there's all sorts of questions. Did you notice what Eve declared? She said this, I have gotten a man with the help from the Lord. With the help from the Lord. You see, she viewed Cain as a gift from God. Do you think it's possible that Adam and Eve had discussions when Eve became pregnant to realize, hey, when we left the Garden of Eden, God promised us that he would one day send a rescuer. And it would be from the offspring of the woman. And so is it possible that they could have discussions, Adam and Eve, to say, I wonder if this is going to be the Savior of the world? Is this the rescuer that's going to be born? But then we see that Eve gives birth to another son, and his name is Abel. Now here's the thing. We don't know much about Cain and Abel's upbringing. We don't know if they're buddies. We don't know if they fought all the time. We just really don't know. But what we do know is what the text tells us. And it tells us this, that Cain is a farmer of the ground, just like his daddy. And Abel was a shepherd. He oversaw a flock. Biblically speaking, they both had worthy professions. But look at what it says in verse 3. It says, in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of that firstborn of his flock on their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. In the course of time. So meaning this, we don't know if this is the first time they brought an offering to the Lord or if this is the 10th time they brought an offering to the Lord. But here's what we know, that Cain brought an offering of the ground to the Lord, of the fruit of the ground. And Abel brought an offering of his first of his flock and of their fat portions. And how did the story play out? It says this, that the Lord accepted Abel's offering and he rejected Cain's offering. Here's the question. Why did God accept Abel's, but reject Cain's? Maybe you grew up in church and you've heard the story a lot in your life. And so maybe you came to the conclusion, like I did as a kid, that the reason that God accepted Abel's sacrifice is because Abel's was a blood sacrifice, right? But that's actually not what's happening here. Because the Bible actually honors both types of sacrifices that are seen here. So what is it? Why did God accept Abel's? And why did God reject Cain's? Listen, it has less to do with the offering and has everything to do with the heart behind the offering. And that's an important thing here. Look at the details again. We could say this, that both Cain and Abel are seeking God. Abel was a shepherd. Cain was a farmer. And so if you're a farmer, right? If you're producing stuff out of the ground, that's your income. If you're Abel and you're a shepherd, we could say this, that, hey, his herd was how he made an income. That was how things worked out for him. The number of sheep, the number of goats, the number of lambs that they gave birth to, right? That would determine the income that Abel would actually have. And so think about this. If Abel was going to be financially responsible, here's what he would have done. He would have let the whole year develop. and he would have seen how many new births he would have had. And then he would have made a sacrifice to the Lord because he would have known, he would have had all the numbers in front of him. So let's just say that Abel and his flock, they gave birth to 20 new animals, 20 new births. For him to give 2 of those to God as a sacrifice is no big deal, right? He's giving out of abundance. It doesn't really cost him anything to actually do that. But what did Abel do? Hey, church, here's what he did. He gave in humility. Abel gave his offering in humility. He approached God in such a way where it says this in there. He gave God his firstborn. So what does that mean? That means this. This is so significant to the motive of Abel. He approached God on God's terms. He approached God on God's terms. And the sacrifice was significant because what if Cain would have only had 2 new births in his flock that year? He just sacrificed 50% of his income. He just gave up 50% of everything that he has to provide for his family, to live his life. Like that's it. It's all here. And so Abel's heart is clear for us all to see. He gave out of joy. He gave out of trust. He gave out of loyalty to the Lord. In other words, here's what Abel's saying. God, because you are first, I'm giving my first to you. It's yours. You can have it. God, I trust you with the details of my life. And what was God's response? He accepted Abel's offering. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 11, which is often described as the great faith chapter, we learn this, that Abel's name is listed there as a great person of faith. And so we've seen what's happening in Abel's heart, but what's actually happening in Cain's heart? You see, for Cain, he was a little more calculated. You see, his heartbeat was to only give to God what he had to actually give to God. And to be honest with you, Cain is not found in Hebrews chapter 11 in the great faith chapter. His name is actually not listed there as someone who had great faith. So I guess we have to ask the question, did Cain have faith? Did Cain actually believe in God? Is that true of him? Listen, we know that Cain is hardworking. We know in our culture we could say this about Cain, that he went to church. He did make an offering. He did make a sacrifice to God. Both Cain and Abel are both trying to please God. But here's the thing. Everything happening here has to do with the motive of the heart. And Abel gave everything to God. And Cain came to God wanting to get something from God. Abel gave out of humility. Cain gave out of pride. And here's the biblical truth, that pride over humility is always a recipe for disaster. Hey, James chapter 4 tells us this, that God opposes the proud. Let me say it in our way. God hates our pride. He hates it. He's appalled by it. He's offended by our pride. But the verse also says this, he gives grace to the humble. He is for those who humble themselves before him, who put themselves in a place where they desperately need God to come through for them. You see, an empty ritual with an empty heart is an invitation for God's rejection. Cain's offering was exaltation of self over God. He carried out that offering with himself at the center. So I wonder if it sounded like this. God, I'm a farmer. I work long hours. I get up early in the morning. I go to bed really late. God, reward my work. Bless me for all the work that I've done. God, you should be grateful that I gave you anything. You see, Cain believes this, that God owes him because of what he's done. God owes him because of his effort. In other words, Cain's not in debt to God, but God's indebted to him. What do you do when you believe this, that God owes you because of your effort, but he doesn't acknowledge it? What do you do when you say, God, I've worked very hard, and all you do in response to my hard work and my performance is you reject it? Here's what you do. End of verse 5. So Cain was very angry, and his face had fallen. Here's what you do. You get angry. You get mad. Someone has blocked you from what you want. And you're angry. You're upset. You're frustrated with the Lord. That's actually what's happening right here, because here's the belief. You believe that you should be accepted by what you bring to the table, but when you think that you should be accepted by what you bring to the table, God will every time, he will reject your offering. And so God's rejection of Cain had everything to do with Cain's heart. You see, God doesn't want the offering. God wants our hearts, but he knows through the offering that you give, it reveals if he actually has your heart. And so this offering is crucial. So let me just be honest with you and say that our churches in West Michigan are full of Cains. Are you one? Are you a Cain? Honestly, just to be clear, we are all Cains. We're prideful. We want our way. We want to worship ourselves. We want to sacrifice very little. We're going to give God our leftovers. And so just like Cain, here's what we often do in West Michigan. We approach God on our terms. God, I'll give you worship, but it's going to be leftover. God, I'll give you money. I'll be quote unquote generous, but it's going to be leftover. God, I'll serve you in certain ways, but it's going to be leftover. Everything is about us. And God's offended by that. The book of Exodus tells us this, that our God is a jealous God. And God gets jealous when you and I give to ourselves what only he deserves. God is also jealous because God's jealous for relationship with you. Like he wants you to know him in such a deep and personal way. He wants relationship. He loves you deeply, and he wants what's best for you. And here's what's true, biblically speaking. God, in his jealousy, is going to get the glory no matter what. And he'll get his glory in your life through you humbling yourself through his grace, or he will get his glory through your life in your pride through his justice. Either way, he's getting it. It's not yours. It doesn't belong to you. You can't have it. Now, let me just take a side step here, step outside the message for a moment, and just ask a couple key questions. Here at Redemption Church, we haven't talked or done a message on finances or money and giving and generosity, I think since like 2018. It's been quite a while. But this text forces every one of us to ask some important questions. And that first is this: do you give to God first? Do you give to God first? Or is God just getting your leftovers all the time? One way that we demonstrate humility and kill our pride is by giving to God first and trusting God with the details of our lives. Another follow-up question we could ask is this: do you give sacrificially to God? If this is your home church, do you give sacrificially here? 2% of Christians give. Do you know that? 2% of Christians give, and when they give 2%. If you lost 2% of your income today, does it change anything you do in your life? Listen, the same questions I'm asking you, I'm asking me, so hear me say that. This is about us all. Do you give first to the Lord? Do you give sacrificially to the Lord? Because we can make the observation that reveals a lot about our hearts if we're actually with the Lord and if the Lord is with us. Oftentimes, where our money goes reveals a lot about who we are. And so I think the challenge for us is to remember this, that if you give sacrificially and if you give first, what that reveals about your life is beautiful, because what it reveals is this: it reveals that grace has changed you. Our generosity is motivated by God's kindness and God's grace to us. He's so kind and he's so good. I just want to encourage you to meet God there and watch how God comes through for you. It's important. All right, what's so devastating about anger? Let's step back into Genesis 4. Here's the trail that anger blazes. Here's a second thing, is that anger's jealousy will ruin your relationships. Look at the second part of verse 5. It says, so Cain was very angry, and his face fell. So the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Cain spoke to his brother or to Abel, his brother. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel, and he killed him. And the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel, your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. So Cain is very angry in verse 5. Ever been very angry before? What a descriptor of his heart. Very angry. Do you think that Cain just looked over at Abel's sacrifices and saw what Abel did and saw what was accepted, and he just became furious inside? Like, I think that's what's actually happening in his heart. Do you think jealousy started to build up inside him, that I want what Abel wants? You see, but here's the truth. Cain's hatred of God actually started to distort his body. He's very angry, and his face has actually fallen. You see, and here's the thing about anger. Here's what you need to write down. At the root of anger is what you love. At the root of anger is what you love. At the root of anger is when someone tries to threaten or take away what you value most. What you love and what you value reveal everything that you get angry about in your life. And so Cain is angry. Why? Because God has blocked what he wants. So think about this for a minute. Who's God in the text? We've established this in the story of Genesis. This is Elohim, right? This is the God in the Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God. Like, this is the God who, with all his power and majesty, spoke and created all of creation. Like, that's who he's talking to here. He's talking to Elohim. It's the same God in Genesis chapter 3, that when Adam and Eve sinned, God walked in the garden. He calls out to them just like he's doing with Cain. And he could have destroyed Adam and Eve and started over, but he didn't. So think about how Cain is talking to Elohim here. He's talking with such an abrasiveness. He's angry. He's frustrated. It's almost like he's saying this to God: how dare you tell me that my sacrifice is not good enough? Look at what happens in verse 6 and 7 again. Look at it with me. The Lord said to Cain, why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Listen, just like Adam and Eve in the garden, here comes God asking Cain some questions. And he says this: why are you so angry? Why is your face fallen? By the way, God is not asking questions because he needs answers. He knows everything. God's not asking questions to actually see Cain's heart. He knows Cain's heart fully. He's Elohim. He fully sees every aspect of his heart. God is asking questions to Cain in order that those questions might be a mirror back to Cain, in order that Cain might see what's happening in his heart. In other words, God graciously and kindly asks questions so we can see what he sees. If you do well, will you not be accepted? Sin is crouching at the door. Did you catch how God described sin? He described it as crouching. As crouching. In other words, what are some animals that crouch? Do you think God is referencing a kitten here? The kitten is crouching at the door. Cool. No, I think this is a lion. A lion is crouching at a beast. Is crouching at the door. And so here's what God is saying. Hey, Cain, you cannot tame sin. You must kill it. You have to rule over it. You have to dominate it. You have to slam the door in sin's face, because if you don't, here's what we do. We open the door and we invite the lion into our life and into our heart, and we okay its presence in our life. But here's the thing: when you sin, you feed the presence of sin. You feed a force, you feed a power. And so no wonder we have a hard time breaking sinful habits, because we've said yes to the crouching beast for so long that we don't know how to get rid of it anymore. Hey, church, what you feed will grow, and what you starve will die. What you feed will grow, and what you starve will die. What are you feeding in your life right now? Because what you're feeding is a crouching beast. And that thing's not looking to be a pet. That thing's looking to devour your entire life. And when you start by doing sin, then sin will actually do you in. And so sin creates a presence in our life. And then it creates a presence not just in us, but a presence around us. Every one of us has the decision to make every single day. What kind of door are we opening? Are we going to open the door to the beast and try to tame a raging lion that wants to devour us? Or we're going to keep that door shut and open the door to the Father who speaks grace, kindness, and love into our lives? The choice is yours. Value and identity versus trying to find some kind of pleasure. But you know, at some point, that thing is absolutely going to eat you. James 4:1 says this. What causes quarrels and what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? What a great question. What's this text saying? Before you're ever at war with anyone else, you're first and foremost at war with yourself. There's a war happening in you. There's a war happening inside of me, and it's a big deal. And so often we choose to play nice with sin because we don't view it as destructive. Listen, the lion will devour your life. You cannot tame it. You can't rationalize it. You can't minimize it. We need to stop trying to deal with it in those ways. It can't be tamed. It must be killed. And so here's what's true. You kill the lion, or the lion's going to kill you. Those are the two choices. And many of you are walking around with a lion on a chain as a pet. And all you're doing is leaving yourself so vulnerable. So at some point, that thing is going to devour your life. And we visualize it as a little kitty, but it's going to crush you. That's a door that you've opened. And so how did Cain respond to the war within himself? Here's what he did. He went and he argued with his brother, right? I mean, it did say in the text, he spoke to Abel. No, that's not what happened. Oh, I know. He gave Abel the silent treatment for a few weeks. Nah, that's not what happened. Oh, I know. He went and he wrestled his little brother and he hurt him and watched his little brother run to mommy for the millionth time in their life. No, that would make sense to me. No, here's what Cain did. He murdered his brother. Hey, church, you don't just wake up one day and commit murder. That is a long walk in the wrong direction. In Genesis 1:27, if you've been with us from the beginning, it said that God created every man, woman, right, in his image. Male and female, he created them. We talked about how that speaks to the value of understanding biblical sexuality, but it also speaks to the value of every human life. That's why we stand for the unborn. That's why we say things like no to Proposal 3, because of what it wants to actually do. But please know, here in the first family, we have murder. One observation of Genesis 1:27 is no murder. We said that. No murder. In the first family, right here, we have murder. Unbelievable. What did Cain do to get to this place? Here's what Cain did. He nurtured his hatred like a hobby. He watered his anger and his hatred and his pride like we would water our grass in a 100-degree July day. He fed his pride, his anger, like we would feed an angry beast who hasn't eaten in a few days. It's almost if Cain is saying this, God, you want a blood sacrifice? I'll show you a blood sacrifice. And we can make the observation that sin divides, sin destroys, and then sin leads to death. Look at verse 8 again. Cain spoke to Abel's brother, and when they're in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel, and he killed him. And the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel, your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. Sin destroyed this whole family. Do you realize that sin will start ruining you, and then it's going to start ruining everyone around you? It'll ruin people in your family. It'll ruin people in your workplace. It always affects every part of our life. Listen, have you ever chose bitterness over forgiveness before? You're feeding a beast. Do you choose lust over love? You're feeding a beast. Do you choose comfort over dealing with conflict? So you bury it under the rug, hoping that these situations in our family and in our life will resolve on their own. You're feeding a beast. It's going to ruin you. And this family right here is ruined. God asks Abel, where's your brother? How do you think Cain's response was? What do you think his tone was like? Hey, God, I'm sorry. Am I my brother's keeper? I didn't know that I was supposed to do that. I'd love to be able to help next time. Was that his tone? Is that how you respond when you get very angry? I'm so sorry. Or do you think his response is more like this? Am I my brother's keeper? I don't know where he is. He's his own man. What does Cain do? He lies to God's question. He lies. Do you think that Cain, after he murdered his brother, left him out in a field just to bleed out and went back to have dinner with Adam and Eve, his mom and dad? Oh man, I'm starving. What are we having for dinner tonight? Well, we're gonna wait for Abel. I'm gonna be waiting for a long time. This is a mess, friends. This is a mess. He ruined his family. And what does God say? He says, your brother's blood is crying out to me. Here's the beautiful part of that statement from God. Every injustice that happens in the world, the God of justice sees and he hears. And that's good news for you and I. And then God, he goes on and he actually curses Cain. He actually takes away his profession. He wasn't gonna go home anymore. He was a fugitive and he was wandering. You see, Cain's anger ruined every relationship he had in his life. Now put yourself in Adam and Eve's shoes. They lost a son to murder and they lost their oldest son because he goes away. They went from having 2 sons to now being empty nesters because of sin. What's so devastating about anger? Listen, the trail of anger, it starts with pride that severs our worship. It really deals heavily with our hearts in big ways and in jealousy, and it ruins every relationship we have. But then thirdly, we can say this, that anger's anxiety will crush your spirit. Look at verse 11 with me. It says, and now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. And when you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. And Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. And whoever finds me will kill me. And the Lord said to him, not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him 7-fold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord, and he settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Do you see what he said in verse 13? God, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Here's what God just did by the curse. God just crushed Cain's identity. Hey, Cain, you've been working so hard to try to impress me with this incredible effort that you're a great farmer, that it produces great fruit for you. Here's the thing, all that's gone. It's done. By the way, it produced great things because I'm kind to you. You can't actually make the ground do anything, Cain. And your profession that you think you're so great at, it's over. It's done. His identity as a farmer is over. And now we have a guy named Cain who commits the first murder in the world, and he's defined by his sin. No wonder Cain is anxious here. No wonder, like, this is more than I can bear. Like, that makes total sense. What am I supposed to do, God? How am I gonna make a living? I'm the best in the world at producing stuff from the ground. I'm a great farmer. God says, yeah, you're gonna have to find another way. That ground will never produce for you ever again. Go ahead. Give it a try, Cain. It's not going to happen. Here's what Cain wants. Cain is not interested in a renewed heart. Cain wants a reduced sentence. And we all know this. We know what that's like for ourselves to actually experience that for us. But here's the thing. God is jealous. And God's not going to allow you to have the glory. We've already established that. And we see that happening right here. The anger of his heart is so significant. The pride is so evident, it destroys everything. He broke his own life apart. He broke his family apart. And he's not even sorry that he killed his brother. The effects of anger are devastating. When I think about anger, Pastor Steve and I were talking about it this week, we think about our tornado. Like everything seems fine in front of the tornado, but after the tornado goes through a town or a city, it leaves a wake. Like everything is in ruin behind it. And that's a good picture of destruction that anger does in our life, because Cain actually chose to now separate from God because God would not meet him on his terms. Here's the question I wrestle with when I read Genesis 4. What would have happened if Cain would have repented? What, when God asked him, hey, Cain, where's your brother Abel? And he would have said, God, I murdered him. I let my anger win. And he was broken by his sin. What if he was just honest with God? What does the Bible say? God gives grace to the humble. You see, God kept giving him opportunity to respond, and he kept rejecting that invitation for relationship, and God is jealous of that. He wants relationship with us. And what was Cain's response? Verse 16, then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord, and he settled in the land of Nod. Hey, church, is there clarity of God's presence in your life? Is there clarity of God's presence? Can you put your finger on your life in such a way you can say, no, I know I have God's presence in this way? If you're too busy just giving God your leftovers, the presence is never going to be there. You're not going to know it. You're not going to experience it. So Cain leaves Eden, and he heads to Nod. He lives a restless life without God. His family becomes known as inventors. In fact, they have credit for building potentially the first city in the world. His family does. What cool accomplishments. Yet we know this about Cain. He left no legacy, spiritually speaking, behind in his life. Yet on his way out, he asked God for one more thing. One more favor. The Cain who's rejected God wants God's help. And in verse 14, he pleads with God's help. God, someone's going to kill me if they find me. So God says, no, Cain, I'm going to be gracious to you and kind to you. I'm going to put a mark on you so no one will do that. And by the way, that's called common grace. And if you're here this morning and you don't know Jesus, I want you to understand something about common grace. God gives us to every person in the whole world. Experiences his common grace. If you're breathing right now, that's grace. You have a job, that's grace. All God's grace is everywhere in our life, and he gives it to every person in the world because he's that kind, even to people who hate him. Our gospel takeaway this morning is this, is that sin's trail of devastation ends at Jesus' plan of restoration. So can I just ask the question, how do we identify ourselves in the story? When we heard the story as a kid, what did you think? Don't we work really hard to identify ourselves as Abel in the story? We're Abel. I mean, think about Cain for a minute. He asked God for help on the way out. So we have a predator that's now acting like a victim. We often think for ourselves that we are the victims. But let me be honest with you. Every one of us has lived the way of Cain, that we stand before the God of holiness with blood on our hands. Our anger reveals what we love, and our anger reveals what we value, and the anger's been divisive in the Church of Jesus Christ for far too long. But let me tell you some good news for a moment for the room full of Cains. Welcome. We're all on the same page together. Here's the good news. God made a promise in Genesis 3:15. That he was going to send a rescuer. And one day, a greater Abel was born. And this greater Abel, he came into a world that was full of Cains, full of people who were making religious decisions, full of people who could check a religious box, full of people who were making all sorts of offerings to God, full of people who were probably just giving their leftovers, full of people who would be full of the churches in West Michigan. It's all full of Cains, and he entered into that world of these religious people, and they hated him, and they killed him. Therefore, Jesus' blood cries out in a better way than Abel's. And in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 24, it says this, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. What does this mean? Listen, it means this for you and I, for a room full of Cains. Here's some good news, that Jesus stands before the Father saying that his demands for justice has been met. Jesus' blood was shed. Not your blood, not my blood. It was his blood that was shed that provides hope for people who have anger issues, who provide hope with a room that are full of Cains. Because Jesus' blood was shed, we stand secure in the justice of God, which then means this, that God's justice is not against you, but God's justice is for you. Why? Because it's at the cross of Christ where the greater Abel was nailed. We see the beautiful love of God, and we see the wrath and justice of God collide in that place on that cross. And God declares this over our sin, that he wins, that he's victorious, that he dictates it all, and Jesus blazes a new trail for the redeemed. And so if you know Jesus, you now stand before God just as if you've never sinned. And you stand before God just as if you've always perfectly obeyed. That's not too shabby, right? That's some good news for us. And by the way, no matter how angry you are when you came in this morning, he's offering that same thing to you. And so where is anger getting in the way of God's purpose for your life? How are you going to deal with it? I think we need to do the same thing that Abel did. We need to come before the Lord. We need to say, God, I'm angry because I'm not getting my way. Just call it what it is. God, I'm angry because what I love I'm not receiving. God, I'm angry because what I value is not happening. And here's what God will tell you. You're loving the wrong thing. You're valuing the wrong thing. So bring yourself and lay it before me, he's saying, and here's, let me speak value into your life. Let me speak love into your life. And we just need to come before the Lord with open, broken hearts and say, God, I'm a mess inside. It's not working out. Things aren't going how I want it to go. Everything around me is falling apart when I get angry. God's like, let me help you. Let me deal with your pride. Will you come to me in humility? Church, this is all about a heart issue. Do you want him, or do you want just to do your life how you want to do it? Because the open door is here. To give worship to who deserves it. To give praise to who deserves it. To give love and adoration to the one who deserves it. Let's pray. Jesus, I want to thank you for your love for us. When I think about what was birthed in Cain, and what the fruit of what he gave life to, Lord, is scary. So I just want to pray for the room this morning right now, Lord, as we think about this topic of anger, this topic of us being first versus you being first, the topic, Lord, of wanting our way, of you or someone else blocking what we want, and therefore we give everybody our wrath. Lord, I just want to pray that we'll surrender our hearts to you. Because there's nothing better than you. That when we get angry at injustice that happens in our world, God, you see it, you hear it, and you promise to deal with it. So I want to pray, Lord, that we'll come with open hearts to want to trust you, just like Abel did. To say, God, I don't know how I'm going to financially make it, but I'm giving you first and I'm giving you best. I pray, Lord, that we will surrender it all to you today. In your name. Amen.